Room is filling up. Welcome everyone to the partner learning session, utilizing measurement to catalyze change. And I know a number of you who are coming in, this is not your first Zoom rodeo. So as always, would really appreciate knowing who's joined us. And so if you could, as you're coming in the room, wouldn't mind chatting your name, your pronouns, and your organization, just so we know who all is with us. And if you're willing, it's always great to see people's faces. And so no worries if that's not possible, but don't worry about dogs or chaos in the background. Sometimes that's welcome. It reminds us that we all are living in a little bit of chaos. With that, I will pass it over to Liz Baxter to welcome us and to kick us off.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monty. And the session is being recorded because we know that a lot of folks may have to come and go during this session. But I'm Liz Baxter, the CEO here at the Sound ACH. And this is, I don't even know if it's the third or the fourth or the fifth in a series that we've been doing for the past year, ever since we really made a commitment with our board and with our team to be focused on how we jointly learn about the vital conditions for well-being and embedding that in with our earlier commitment to targeted universalism and building a region where everyone feels a sense of belonging. And then, of course, in the last year, getting just much more explicit about the fact that we've got some structural and systemic barriers to well-being and being very, trying to find ways that we can all work together on that. But we typically start our meetings with a land acknowledgement. And so, just for myself and many of our team members, we're sitting on the traditional homelands of the Lummi and Nooksack people. But we begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people since time immemorial. And at the bottom of this slide, and I see that Stacy has put it in the chat box, is a link where you yourself can go. You can put in your address, your zip code, and it will tell you whose native land you're sitting on right now, or the land where you were when you were younger, went to school, etc. It's just really informative to see the history and the culture that surrounds us that sometimes might seem invisible. But here in the North Sound region, it's really important because we are treated with a lot of generosity and sharing of knowledge and wisdom from our tribal partners. So we learn a lot on that. And so this session, and I will turn it over, back to Monty to really facilitate it, is about data and measurement. And while that might seem like it's very cerebral and uses like one side of our brains, it's really important for us to tie that in as we're thinking about the types of impact that we'd like to have in the community and how we can begin to share the stories of what we've learned and how we're actually making a difference in the lives of the people that we care about around us. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, and so grateful for the teams that have joined us from elsewhere and our local colleagues that'll be on some of the panels. So thanks, and Monty, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Liz. And I think our agenda for the day is pretty straightforward. So we'll do a light touch just to remind folks about this framework that has been guiding this partner learning session. And then, as we often have done, is really bring in an outside voice, a national perspective. In this case, you'll hear from the Imagine Fox Cities team around how they're using measurement to catalyze change. And then we'll flip that over to really leaning into and understanding where there's some local experience and some expertise and insight as it relates to kind of thinking about measurement in the broadest sense of how that can and is catalyzing change here. And then, throughout this, there's opportunities for you all to connect with peers in the chat, and we've reserved a little time at the end to connect on what you're hearing that seems significant, other questions that are bubbling up for you, or possibilities for kind of future learning as a network. So that's kind of the flow we're going to follow. And as Liz has already kind of pointed out, that's kind of this thriving together approach or framework has emerged really through the wisdom of over the last couple of decades, and in particular got accented, with non-governmental organizations and community-based groups, including both the North Sound and the Imagine Fox Cities groups. And the ideas are, really understanding how we might situate our work in the legacies. And those are legacies that are, we inherit from our ancestors from the past in many cases, that in some cases are assets that affirm our dignity and inclusion. And in many cases, hundreds of years, sometimes are legacies that really have passed on exclusion and harm and trauma that we still feel today. This model really looks at those vital conditions, the 7 vital conditions that you all have seen. We've done a handful around basic needs, around food, around freedom from trauma and violence and addiction. We've done some other pieces on humane housing, but these vital conditions that we know through human experience and also through research and evidence, that these are the vital conditions that all human beings need, no matter where they are in their life course, on a frequent basis, in order to realize their full potential, in order to thrive, in order to experience well-being. And so part of the work, and as Liz had kind of shared around how we work together in a group like the North Sound ACH and the partnership and other partnerships that are on this call, the work of stewardship, whether we refer to it as stewardship or not, is really how we expand those vital conditions so that all people have the potential to thrive, and really working across differences to make that happen. And, as we think about stewardship today, it's not just situating our work around the legacies of the past, but realizing that we have an opportunity to shape new legacies of inclusion so that everybody can thrive. So that's guided a lot of the thinking and work nationally and locally with some of us on the phone today. And we're going to get a chance to hear from Imagine Fox Cities that have been thinking about where does measurement fit in their work as they are working towards improving and really advancing equitable being in their communities. And so spoiler alert, and Liz alluded this too, that this is not really just about measurement. It's really about what are all the things that we wrap around measurement. What we measure matters immensely. And I think you're going to hear about some of that through the Imagine Fox Cities. How we engage, how we make meaning of it, and what we do about it is really very important. And I think that the journey that North Sound has been on, you're going to hear some shades of that around the emphasis on next generation. I think you all are both unique in the sense that you care deeply about what you're passing on. It's part of your ethos, as well as just kind of really thinking very specifically and intentionally around belonging. So with that in mind, I'm really grateful I've had a chance to work for the last few years with the folks that are going to present here. But Paula, Jason, Rayon, thank you for being here. And Paula, I'll pass it to you.
Hey, all right. Well, let me tee up some slides here. All right. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
That's a yes. All right. All right. Clean it up a little bit here. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you folks today. We're in the middle of Wisconsin, and our temperature is going to get up to about 80 in the next day or so. So we are thrilled after this long winter. So hope you folks are enjoying some great weather on the West Coast as well. I'm, as Monty mentioned, Paula Morgan. I'm a director of community health for Theta Care Health System here in the Fox Cities. It's about 7 hospitals and 30-some clinics, and our system has always had a very integrated approach to improving community health, very engaged in our communities. The Fox Cities, if you're trying to look out the Fox Cities on a map somewhere, you're going to have a hard time finding it because there is no place actually called the Fox Cities. Appleton is probably the biggest community here. If you looked up Appleton, Wisconsin, we're about a half hour south of Green Bay, a couple hours north of Milwaukee. but there's about 19 municipalities adjacent to Appleton along the Fox River here that make up the Fox cities. And so my job this morning is to kind of tee up Imagine Fox Cities and how we got started. Then I'm going to pass it on to Jason and Rayon to talk more specifically about the measurement and what's come of the measurement that we did. So we got started with the Imagine Fox Cities work about 3 years ago or so. So it's really in its infancy yet. What we found in our community was that, I don't know if your communities are like this, but we had a handful of community leaders who, we really stand on their shoulders in terms of bringing this region, the Fox Cities region, forward over, the last generations, And several of those leaders, they first of all, they had a pretty common vision of what they wanted the Fox Cities to be and how to bring the various municipalities along in sort of a unspoken shared vision. But several of those leaders were passing on. And, we had some conversations around, well, who's going to be this next set of leaders, and will they have the same sense of importance around moving forward collectively as the Fox Cities, and with the divisiveness over the last 4 or 5 years that's been happening across our country, we're somewhat worried that, could that really take hold here, and each municipality care more about itself as opposed to really thinking about the greater good of the region, which really provides exponential benefits to everybody. The other piece that was spurring us on to want to create a vision for the area is, just the diversity that was coming into our area and the challenges that we were having in necessarily appreciating that diversity and making sure that everybody felt like they belonged in this community and that they had a role to play and they could see themselves living here for longer periods of time. And we had some major organizations that were really struggling with keeping a workforce here, a diverse workforce here. So all of that was leading us to, how do you go about making change happen? And I think we all know that the most effective change that happens when you have sort of a North Star created. And it's a North Star that's not just created by 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5 people, but it's a North Star that people across the community are able to put their fingerprints on and help design it. And so that's really what we did next. We knew we wanted to create a vision. We ended up pulling together a team of maybe 15, 20 people across the community, leaders across the community, to test the idea, just to make sure that it made sense and people could get behind this idea. And kind of passing that test, then we brought Monty in, and he helped us to do a design phase where we engaged diverse people across the community just to design the process we would go through to actually create a living vision. So it's not about creating a vision statement as much as describing what we want to be as a community and making sure that our actions and our decisions align to that vision. And our process was really 4 phases. One was just assessing our capacity. Do we have, even the funding or the people power to put the energy into this work at this time, and what do we need to shore that up? And then the second piece is really what we're going to talk to you a lot about today is understanding where we stood in terms of overall health and well-being of our community. What's kind of our baseline? And then where are we really falling short? Where are the opportunities to really enhance those vital conditions that we know improve health? And how do you do that in a way that's really inclusive? So you're hearing from the people that, from an equity standpoint, most need the support in our community. Our third phase was about discernment, taking all the information that we learned about and then figuring out what that really meant in terms of crafting a vision. And the fourth part happened late in 2019, just pre-COVID, but we were focused on hosting a summit where we engaged hundreds of people from the community to just join us at a large banquet hall and toss out a draft of a vision and help us reshape that and mold it and discuss what it means, create meaning out of it, and then think about, how we help bring this to life, across our region. So I'm gonna just advance here. This is just a picture of our summit that we held late 2019. You just can see a big room full of people, but lots of diverse voices were heard that day, and it resulted in this. This is a very shortened version of our living vision, that we imagine the Fox Cities as a place with positive paths for kids, an economy working for all, widely shared spaces and culture where all belong. So that's a shortened version. The longer version can be seen at imaginefoxcities.com. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jason Schulist. And Jason, if you want to introduce yourself, and Jason will share more about the process we went through on data collection and meaning making out of that data.
Thank you. I'm Jason Schulist. I currently work as a vice president of operational excellence at a construction company. And I've done continuous improvement, data, Six Sigma, all that kind of fun stuff over my career. When we did this work, the result of what you saw on the previous page came from two streams of data collection. One was 80 community conversations. So we actually sat down with 800 people over 80 conversations with facilitators, and those facilitators listened to the community talk about what some of the well-being was in the community, and where were they not feeling well-being. And we had a scribe that would then write down all of these qualitative data statements. We also had 2,800 surveys, which is pretty good for a population of 250,000 as a community, that were collected from the residents in a time frame of between February and July of 2019. And we tried to make sure that when we were taking the survey that we were reflecting the demographics of the community, so that we, from a statistical data perspective, had enough confidence interval work and all the funny, all the funny data stuff that you might want to talk about to say that, is this legitimate or is this not? And you'll see in a few slides forward, you can see where some of the confidence intervals are very wide, because we might have had a small data set that would allow us in some subgroups of demographics to not really, not understand fully what we need to know. I was going to click a slide, but I can't do that. So next slide.
Oh, here, I'll do it for you.
So what we did from that is we created a discernment process. So if you look on the left side, we start with the 2,800 well-being surveys. We did a quantitative analysis, and there is a data team of volunteers, everything from the head of an analytics from a $1 billion company to volunteers that want to work with data at all different levels, that looked at this baseline well-being data and then analyzed it for correlations in specific populations. So we had a little quasi AI type of tool that we used to start to say, can we find some themes here? And we also took the open-ended data, so there were about 4,000 comments that came from these 2,800 surveys, and fed it over to the qualitative analysis. So if you look at the middle part, we did the 80 plus community conversations and a qualitative analysis. And I call this both flavor or affinity mapping, and then intensity or word cloud. So we took the 4,000 data points from the survey and about 5,000 other data phrases, and took all 9,000 of those and placed them on sticky notes with a group of 15 different people from the community. That 15 people were everything from a CEO of a corporation that would come in and volunteer to someone in their 20s that worked at a nonprofit. So we're trying to get that intergenerational perspective as we looked at the data. So we had 15 people from throughout the community to do that. If the same Post-it note came up, we didn't make two, we made one. So we're really trying to look at the breadth of the flavor. From there, we could develop some key themes, and then we developed data on the themes. The intensity word cloud, we fed the 9,000 data points back into our data area and created these 2- and 3-word data clouds related to various themes, but we also did it based on all the other demographics we had. So we could look at African American women from 40 to 50 and see kind of what are they saying about well-being or what are they not saying about well-being. So we could start to look at those themes a little bit. We also took existing baseline wellness data and informed some of the data that we already had into this entire soup of data. And then in June of 2019, we got another group of about 16 people to really look at distilling the analysis and did a dialogue session to start saying, here's what we're seeing as themes. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the library. This was done in the Appleton Public Library, and we cordoned this room off for about 4 months and I spent about 50% of my time just kind of in that room or helping to distill data and then bringing different people in. And if you look at it, we had what was going well, what was a barrier, and what were some bold ideas. So if you look at if you take glasses off, you can kind of see where the red is and where the green/yellow is and where the blue is. And each of those started to become themes. The people in the room could take any of the 9,000, which really came down to about a few thousand Post-it notes, but could move them around the room to kind of create that affinity. So the affinity was done organically. Say, oh, wait a minute, this is interesting, but this might mean something relative to this other piece in the room. So it really created a nice dynamic between the 15 people in the community. We also had some contexts that we had in that room when we were looking at it, because sometimes the words made a difference, whether they're coming from African American kids in our public school system, or if it was coming from someone in their 70s or a group or cohort in their 70s that had been in the community for a long time. This gave us kind of the overarching thriving, struggling, and suffering data. So you can see how we're doing both on the well-being and then the question about how do people see it in the future. You normally see we see that there's more optimism about our future as of 2019. But what is also interesting is that 9% said they were suffering. That's double the state average, and I think double the general average. So that gave us also opportunities to think through how we might explore that more deeply.
And maybe just to interject that the well-being survey did use the Cantrell's ladder, and it was open source from the work that Gallup Wellbeing Index has used, and with some additional questions added to it. So just to interject that so folks know, happy to share that as well.
Right. So I'm gonna run through some themes here, but I'm gonna go through the first one for a little bit longer. So when you take all of the things we distilled, we got down to 6 themes. The first one was we have a strong sense of community, but not everybody feels that way. So if you're from the community and always grew up here, you normally felt much more well-being than if you weren't from the community, or if you weren't a middle class and upper white person, I guess would be the best way to put it. That group felt the best. So if we take some of the data, here you can see the good thing for me as I age through life is that well-being seems to get better over time, at least in our area. So it's like red wine, not white wine. And so the older you are, the more well-being you have. If you see the little thing that looks like a Star Wars TIE fighter, that's the upper and lower confidence interval, and then the dot is kind of where the well-being was. So you can start to say, well, 74 and older feels statistically significantly better than a 43 to 54-year-old, because the bottom of that piece is not overlapping the top of the 43 to 54-year-old. So that's kind of how we use that data. The next one that we looked at, or another one that we looked at that was interesting, is gender. So you can it's almost high confidence that males feel better well-being than females do. And if you are not, if you chose not to answer non-binary, you're actually also statistically significantly not feeling the same well-being. So it also gives us a chance to start to explore where do we want to go with themes. The third one we have here kind of was by race. So what it really shows is, look at the white one in the upper right. The white one is pretty tight confidence interval and well-being. All the other races, you don't really, from race to race, you're not seeing anything that's statistically significant, except that if you're not white, you probably have a lower well-being than if you're white based on our surveys. The next area, was a theme was just we prize our cultural and natural assets. We do a lot of convening, both in various, what you see there, I think is either the Mile of Music or it's the Oktoberfest. One is a volunteer event where people serve food. The other one's a big music festival that happens in the center of Appleton. The next slide. There's a will, and we're looking for ways to ensure meaningful and livable wages. There's a whole thing about livable wages, and there were efforts that were going on prior to that and continuing efforts to look at that, especially as we start seeing coming out of COVID, all the jobs available, and we're even seeing some of those wage rates go up. We'll just have to make sure that a livable wage isn't inflation isn't eating up that rise in wage rates. The fourth one is about education being a critical bridge. So we saw a lot of themes on education. Our fifth one was about mental health being on the radar. So it definitely showed up. And you can see if we're having the suffering space that you're probably, one of the things we're seeing is mental health. And the next slide shows one of those word clouds of like what gets in the way of well-being. Out of all the things you see, the bigger the word, the more incidents. So you see mental health, affordable housing, and healthcare became kind of the three top things getting in the way. So mental health really did hit as a broad base. And the next slide is that the future requires new ways of thinking, learning, and working together. So those 6 themes help to inform us in our living vision. And I'll pass it back to Paula. We'll transition over to Rayan in a second.
All right, great. Thanks, Jason. So, I did read this. So now you know where our vision came from. I've read this to you previously, but just a little bit more background on what's really inherent in each of those areas that Jason mentioned. So when it came to imagining a place with kids getting off to a strong start, families, all different families feel that they're supported and have what they need to be successful. They have access to great education that really challenges them. It's the right education for each of the individuals, and that they feel like the village of our community really cares about them. When it comes to the economy that works for everyone, we want a strong, diverse economy that's really well prepared for what's needed in our workforce for the future. And healthy work environments that really nurture the family, taking into account the whole being and provide livable wages and collaboration. I mentioned earlier, we have 19 different municipalities. So how is that environment, that economy really working across all those municipalities to really strengthen the infrastructure that we have here to support that workforce? Shared space and culture, that we have, a strong sense of community and connectedness. We've always appreciated the fact that we have sort of a small town feel here with some of those, big city amenities, and we really want to capitalize on that. But with some of those big city amenities like the events and things that Rayan spoke to, want to make sure that everybody sees themselves in those opportunities. And we've got some beautiful nature areas with our river and parks, and and again with 19 municipalities, how are we ensuring that we're all connected so that people can bike and walk and across all of this space and feel like they can just go forever, because it's all so integrated. But the big key piece, and I'm going to turn over to Rayan here in just a second, is about belonging. And I mentioned we've had some challenges with help, keeping some of our workforce even here, or people that didn't grow up here feeling like they actually belong and want to take ownership of this community. And just a great way, written in our vision is that people who never leave have no regrets. And those who do leave are constantly tempted to come back. And that's really what we're striving to create. So with, to the point that all of this measurement is actually catalyzing action, I'm going to turn it over to Rayan, who's going to speak to some of the specific action we've chosen to engage in. Oh, before I do that, we've agreed that our Imagine Fox Cities work is not going to be doing a lot of the work as much as sharing the North Star and keeping this vision alive and constantly morphing, for our community. But there are 5 key roles that we do want to have. One is convening, like the summit. We'll host future summits and convene groups. We're going to catalyze, which we are catalyzing work on belonging. Doing this measuring, we're in the process right now of conducting our second well-being measurement, and we'll have that data this summer, so we'll be able to see what changes, particularly COVID, has played, connecting and influencing. So, Brian, now to you.
Thank you, Paula. And so my name is Graham Brown, and I am one of the co-chairs of Imagine Fox Cities. And my other job is I serve as the Executive Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Fox Valley Technical College, which is located in our address says Appleton, but if you're from the area, you will know that we actually exist in one of the municipalities that is called Grand Chute. So when we are really looking at belonging, as Paula said, so the whole framework of Imagine Fox Cities wasn't really for us to be doing, but based on how we were getting the measurements and looking at belonging, we realized that we had to take a little bit more active role within this space. As Jason alluded to with the data collection, a lot of people were feeling great about the Fox Cities, but there were very much a deep understanding with some of our minoritized community members that this, the sense of belonging that others were having, they weren't feeling that same sense of belonging. With that, we ended up with a belonging committee that both Jason and myself, have been engaged with since the beginning. It's co-chaired by, as you can see here, a colleague of mine, Dr. Kimberly Barrett, and another gentleman from Kimberly Clark. His name is Patrick, and work through a process to make sure that we have a process that define what belonging should be and what is the purpose of the belonging group, what our group's objectives were. And, looking at that, we wanted to make sure that one of the first things that we're doing is to educate the community about what it means to belong. We talk about events such as Oktoberfest. I was watching the news, I think this week, and they were saying if they practice social distancing at Oktoberfest, it would actually go from Appleton to the border of Minnesota. That is a lot of people. It's 100 and something thousand people that are participating in that event. However, when we look at a lot of these events, we weren't seeing representation from all of the groups within our community. So we wanted to educate our community about what it means to belong and to use strategies to promote that sense of belonging. And, I was saying earlier in my introduction that I'm a scholar practitioner of John Powell's work on targeted universalism, and understand that the universal goal here, is to make sure that every single person, no matter your race, your identity, your background, your gender identity, sexual orientation, that you have a sense of belonging in the Fox Cities. That's our North Star for belonging. We realize that in order to get there, we had to educate people about different strategies and different approaches that they need in order to work with different populations to make sure that we're reaching that. And also, secondly, we wanted to provide opportunities for active engagement. People tend to have a higher sense of belonging when they're engaged in an active way to shape the future for themselves. One of my talking points for the last 2 years is that we need to quit talking about people when they're not present. We need to quit developing plans to solve a problem for a population without engaging their voices in the solution process. And we want to make sure that people are engaged. Who best knows what needs to be done in order for them to feel as if they belong than the people that already feel that they don't belong? They know what they need. They know the processes that we need to go through in order to get them to that sense of belonging. We need to engage with them and have their voices be a part of the process. And that's one of the things that attracted me to Imagine Fox Cities and the work of Imagine Fox Cities. We use qualitative data, to help to boost, strengthen the impact of the quantitative data. The voices of the people, the qualitative piece actually speaks louder to us as we go through this process, to make sure that we're hearing people and they're present at all times, just to make sure that we're having that mutual understanding. The belonging work group went through, multiple phases. And okay, yes, we're at the second slide for that. We hosted multiple community conversations. Our community conversations were focused and developed on race, racism, and anti-racism. And this format was developed to make sure that our entire community is having a similar conversation. We wanted to make sure that we establish a process so that if a conversation is happening at ThedaCare, where Paula works, and Paula's spouse or partner works at a different organization, when Paula and her partner get home, they can actually engage in that same conversation around that structure. So what we wanted to do was to make sure that our community, we were moving together towards that North Star, where we had a common understanding and a common ground of what we needed to work towards. So that those conversations were happening at all of the major employers throughout our region. For myself at our college, when we started having those conversations, our entire executive team went through the series of conversations, and then we rolled it out to our 3,000 employees. And if you live and work in the Fox Cities, we wanted you to be having that conversation. Another event that we did was we called it the ABC Summit. It was anti-racism, belonging, and community, getting down to the basics for people to understand, what people need to do in order for you to lead a focus on anti-racism that will create a sense of belonging within the community that you live and operate. That summit, we held a half-a-day summit and brought in Tim Wise to be one of our keynote speakers, and we had over 600 participants. We had to deploy some pretty unique strategies to make sure that we were engaging with the right people at the right time. And, some of the targeted universalism strategies and actions that, you might learn throughout the process of engaging in that work that is done by John Powell and his team at UC Berkeley was put into place here. And that all came, right on the cusp of, George Floyd and all of the social injustice situations that were taking place, and our community needed a place where we could have conversations and have dialogue, rather than people that want the same thing is in two different corners of the room and arguing, and we're not coming together to bridge what we need and to work towards and collaborate and figuring out what we need to do. Through those conversations, we started to continue to measure, and we started to sense themes of additional conversations and additional convenings that might need to happen. We then planned a policing on our future convening, where we started off by providing our community with a sense of understanding on the background work of, like the police force and how we got to where we are today. And, we wanted to make sure that we were educating people throughout that series of presentations. And we started off by doing that, and then moved into having conversations with our community members, and then joint conversations with our community and our law enforcement personnel within our region. Doing that in a way where we move people along the spectrum of understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion was important to us in order for us to show the growth and to continue to measure the impact of our work. Well, we did not just want to put people who might see things differently in front of each other and say, go and have a conversation, because we would not get the impact that we desire from that. So education, starting off with educating people, letting all people within our community understand what the outcomes need to be for us to move from suffering to thriving, and to have a high sense of belonging. And that helped. The other thing that we have been working on is adding additional conversation, as you see, in April, focusing on class, allyship, privilege, and bridging. If there's one thing that the last election taught us, is that we need to figure out a way to get our community back together. Even if you have different views and things, for people to have productive conversations. We were in a state where people weren't listening to each other, right? We just had people making noise, and we wanted people to understand, we need to bridge these conversations and try to find a way for us to work together in order to advance the community that we all live in. These conversations continue, and we're working with our faith community and a group called Common Ground on conversations focusing on belonging with, large and small groups. And, even sometimes I think we now have 10 facilitators that are trained to help us advance these conversations to bring people together. When we really look at belonging, the belonging work for Imagine Fox Cities, it focuses, while we focus so heavily on that, is Paula mentioned that, we were losing people and people like myself that eventually ended up staying and calling this home still had a harder time staying connected or getting connected with people within our community. And we wanted to make sure that we were spending a little bit of more time focusing on that, because if we want the community to continue to grow for the future and to continue to evolve for generations. And, Liz did this amazing opening and, acknowledging that we're all a native lands and all of these things. So I want to acknowledge, whether or not it's known to most people, planning for generations is not a thing that corporate America decided that they're going to do. This is something that was adopted from our native partners. Our native partners don't think for today, they don't think for tomorrow, they think for multiple generations ahead of them. And, and this process was built into Imagine Fox Cities, because we know that we're not going to be here for the future, but the work that we do today to create that sense of belonging and well-being is going to impact those that come after us. And it is our jobs as leaders within our community to create the spaces to make sure that those that come after us have an easier lift, in order to make sure that they can maintain this living vision of Imagine Fox Cities, to hopefully make the Fox Cities a place where, no matter who you are or where you come from, it's a place where we can all call home, and we no longer have to worry about our top talent and our top skilled employees running to larger cities such as Minnesota or Chicago. We can create that oasis of love, happiness, and belonging for people of all gender, race, identities, and ethnicities within our community. So that's just a little bit about some of the key belonging work that we do, and how we have worked up until today to ensure that we're doing what we need to do to advance that work and to help people within leaders within our community continue to build onto that for the future.
Rayon, that's a really beautiful and I think poignant note to kind of land, the story of Fox Cities. And Jason and Paula, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your journey. I know there's a lot more of that we can uncover. And as we kind of acknowledge, I think there's a lot of shades of similarities around kind of the journey that North Sound ACH and the regional community has been on. So thanks for that. And would love to just pivot over to Alicia. I know you've been having some phone or connectivity issues, but Alicia, can you jump on and maybe kind of guide us through some of the local experiences?
I can, and yeah, if you see my video cut out, my audio is still on. It might just look a little funny for a second, but really appreciate hearing from folks at Fox Cities, especially just how you kicked off that discussion, noting that Fox Cities isn't one place, but 19 municipalities, because I know that here in the North Sound, we've been having a lot of conversations around how do we as a region come together and create a shared vision for our future, and how do we think about really pulling in all members of our community to create that vision to understand well-being. So with that, we have Rachel and Colton with us today to just share a little bit about some of what that looks like locally, how organizations are pursuing that vision. And so rather than introducing them, I'm going to invite Rachel and Colton to introduce themselves just by sharing your name, your organization, and how are you connected to this idea of measuring well-being. And so Rachel, would you kick us off to start?
Sure. Thanks, Alicia. And really hard to follow Ray on, but I'm hopefully going to share some things I think are really supportive of the points he touched on. It's an honor to be with all of you to share some of what we get to work on in our community. Most of the regional partners on this call, I think you know me from my work through community health with Peace Health, which is a collection of 10 hospitals and medical clinics across the Northwest. But what you might not know about me is I've spent the last 5 years really digging in and studying health leadership and systems change. So it's pretty funny to be asked to talk on a session around measurement because I've developed some pretty strong feelings around measurement that really center around relationship. And one of the things that I hope that you all walk away with as I share some of these stories today is that I really believe if we engage in this measurement work as it's intended to improve well-being, that it's inherently relational and that it begins fundamentally with caring. And there's a true risk if we start anywhere other than care, that measurement can become just another assessment that doesn't catalyze real change. So I'll share some other examples after Colton introduces himself.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm Colton Rallo. I supervise the Pathways program here at Seymour Community Health Centers, which is a federally qualified health center in our care management department, which is overseen by the North Sound Accountable Community of Health. The Pathways program, just to provide a little bit of context here, is an evidence-based pay for outcomes model of community-based care coordination. And I think what I love about the model is it's very, there's a lot of data and outcomes that comes from the comprehensive needs assessments that our community health workers administer with clients. And I think, Rachel, as you touched upon, that relational aspect is our community health workers are really able to formulate strong relationships with the clients, the folks that they work with. And I think, what better to have folks that are out in the community build that capacity within the community.
Thank you so much for just kind of sharing a little bit. And I'd like to jump in a little bit deeper. So Rachel, you mentioned you're part of Peace Health, and so approaching measurement as a health system, but also looking more broadly at, what does it mean to really measure and build relationships in that process. So could you share a little bit more just about how in your work you're implementing well-being measures, both internally at Peace Health and with your community partnerships?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. And I think I want to go back to just a little bit about that study that I've had an opportunity to be involved in. So for the last 18 months, I had the fortune of being involved in a research study that was focused entirely around this question of how can communities meaningfully include those who precisely are having the experiences with our systems of health in our community, and are having experiences with those systems that are set up not to serve them well. And that question that was driving, especially my curiosity in this study, was really around how do we ensure we're not only hearing from those individuals that are most impacted by the absence or the insufficiency of those vital conditions showing up in community, but also how can we meaningfully include them in real change? And that was the driver. And similar to Fox City, I was able to find an exemplar, what I think of as truly an exemplar community just here in our backyard in the Pacific Northwest. Some of you may be familiar with a community in Hood River, Oregon. They have something called the Healthy Gorge Initiative. It's been operating for more than a decade. And that was the community where I got to interview and observe and watch them for about 18 months. And came away with some pretty incredible findings about what they're doing that's so unique about how they're including the community. And in Oregon, really similar to Washington, they have a CCO model similar to our ACH model. And one of the drivers out of that CCO was that communities create a community advisory council. And so what they had done here in the Healthy Gorge Collaborative was essentially invite and convene those with lived experience to the table, in this case, Medicaid beneficiaries. So the majority of the roles on this council were those individuals that had that experience with the very health conditions that they were seeking to improve as a community. What was so cool is 40 plus people are attending every month, and still to this day, now that they've gone virtual, are still showing up meeting after meeting because they're getting so much value. Not just those who are experiencing the systems and have the insight into where we need to make improvements, but also all of the health partners, community partners, nonprofits, social services, government are also showing up at that table. On top of that, the council has responsibility for authoring their community health assessment, their community health improvement plan, and they're receiving millions of dollars in social determinant health funding that they get to decide in that region where they allocate those dollars to various programs and initiatives. And maybe I'll tee up to Colton, maybe not surprising, probably one of the areas that they invest the most dollars is in their community health worker program. So they have the most per capita community health workers that they know of in the nation. And those community health workers often are the ones who are assisting and playing this really incredibly supportive mentoring role as they bring new members into the council and welcome them and include them in the change processes. So it's been really fun getting to meet that community and bring back those ideas to the communities that are here that I get to work with in Northwest Washington.
I wonder, Rachel, if you'd say, I'm really curious because so many of us are thinking about how do we long-term engage folks. And you mentioned that group, that community advisory council is really unique and that people are continuing to show up and find value. And so I heard that part of that value is coming from the strength of the community health workers playing a mentorship role. Are there other aspects of that group that you feel like it's really continuing to engage folks long-term?
Yeah, and so relationships are a key aspect. And I started by sharing that it really truly begins with care. And as I interviewed those with lived experience that were serving on the council, but also those who were the folks like in roles like my own and roles that you all have that were showing up at the table because they were a nonprofit leader, or a local partner, or service provider, what I heard time and time and time again was, we have come to care for the people in this council, the people who are involved in this collaborative. We care for them as our neighbors, as our family, as our friends. And it's that fundamentally at that level of when we care, that's how we move to change. That's how we become so outraged about things that we put in the effort, put in the time and commitment to change systems as a community. So that was pretty incredible. They had examples of truly becoming friends, and the consumer members and the partners would say that. And even to this day, they do things socially together, not just showing up at meetings together, but really coming alongside and supporting one another.
So it sounds like it's definitely about more than, hey, we're going to come together and put together a community health needs assessment. Just as important as that community building within the council, which I really appreciate. And I wonder, you mentioned you're kind of taking some of that learning and bringing it back to the North Sound region. So are there things that you're thinking about here with some of the organizations you work with, or just more broadly around how do you capitalize on those amazing relationships and working with people with lived experience to start to create meaning out of some of that data that you're choosing to look at and gathering?
Yeah, great question, Alicia. Always bringing it back local. We have a couple examples that we're really excited about where we're building those relationships. One is on San Juan Island, so a big shout out to Friday Harbor for our friends who are here from the islands. Just an incredible effort on the part of our partners at the Joyce Sobel Family Resource Center. They have just in the last 4 or 5 months convened a group, a Latinx healthcare advisory group that has truly started from that relationship place, met with community members, Latinx community members, and brought and engaged those women in particular in starting to ask these questions in community. But they started with that fundamental question of like, what's even important to you? Where are the health areas that they want to focus? And we just heard an update from them last week, and they have already completed 20 surveys. So that initial group of several women who came to the table and started to convene the community, then translated and rippled out into a group of 8 women who personally called and interviewed neighbors and families that they worked with. And they are bringing that back now to inform our systems. And so really exciting. Still, the work is still in its infancy, but I think it's a great example of those with lived experience truly driving where we need to direct our energy and change and invest.
Well, that might be a good segue into Colton, some of your work. You know, I'm so interested in the Pathways program and have a lot of appreciation for you and the folks you work with in trying to serve individuals in that really holistic sense of addressing a whole lot of different needs and referrals into different systems. So wondering if you can share more about how you're approaching well-being as a measure in the setting of CMAR clinics and FQHCs.
Yeah, so I think CMAR primarily we're a medical clinic, so we're getting a lot of folks that have a lot of high medical needs and they're very complex patients. But I think the one thing to be mindful of is well-being. It doesn't stop once you leave the doctor's office. There's a lot of whether that be emotional, mental health, spiritual well-being that sometimes the medical providers may just not be able to really get a true sense of within that 15-20 minute office visit. And I think that's where the community health workers are so valuable, in that they're able to spend more time with clients and to really be able to, as Rachel mentioned, connect and develop a strong relationship so that some of their story unfolds. And I think that it's important to be mindful that well-being and improving well-being can have an impact on our physical health. So when we think about data and using looking at outcomes, it's not always so simple about for a patient with diabetes, it's not so simple to lower their A1C or manage their blood sugar when they're dealing with a lot of other social determinants of health that are impacting that. And I think that's where community health workers, by looking at well-being and being able to measure that, by focusing on that, I think that there is potential to then improve their physical health. So right now, I believe someone had mentioned previously using the Catalyze ladder as a way to measure well-being. So that is something that we're going to be rolling out when we do an intake, when we have a new client. And the hope is that we can repeat that measurement or assessment and get a sense of has there been an improvement in well-being, and does that are there any patterns there when we look at their physical health.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you mentioned it's an outcomes-based program. So it sounds like as you're building those relationships with individuals, you do still have to track, you have to try and track that relationship to a certain degree. And to me, it's so interesting if you were to use something like Cantrell's ladder. I wonder if you see that as being an opportunity to capture something a little bit more holistic, and what you mentioned, the social determinants of health beyond, did we make a referral to diabetes management?
Yeah, I think what I love about the questions within that assessment is it's really a conversation starter. And again, thinking about data, it's not just that quantitative. It's not just the numbers, the A1C, their blood sugar, or whatever other metrics might be measured in a medical setting. It's we also have to think about the subjective opinions, beliefs, thoughts that are coming from that client. And I think that I think especially for the community health workers that I supervise, I think they're really great about pulling out that story, and through those stories, we can then collect additional data, perhaps identify barriers that are getting in the way of achieving well-being or being able to thrive. So I think that we work with a lot of folks that, looking back at the responses there of suffering and thriving, that we might be working with a lot of folks that are suffering, at least when we first work with them, and to kind of measure, see, is the work that we're doing, are we helping them, increase their level of well-being?
Mhm. So I'm seeing, as you all are talking, people are kind of giving shout outs and calling out some other really interesting programs that are happening. And so just really appreciate that. If anyone wants to share other resources related to measuring well-being and engaging people in meaningful dialogue, feel free to put those in the chat. And also, if you have questions for any of our speakers, feel free to drop those in the chat or call those out. I know we just kind of got like a really quick slice of what you two are doing, Colton and Rachel. And so wondering if I have kind of another question that I'll open up to you two, but also everyone from Fox Cities to kind of reflect on, what are the possibilities you see around using common well-being measures for us to advance equitable well-being across the region. And I know that for me, that belonging committee that you spoke about, Rayon, really resonated as I try myself to define belonging. I loved the way you said it was feeling like being part of a community and also being embraced for who you are and what you bring to that community. So just want to kind of see if there's other thoughts that any of our panelists have around, what is the possibilities or the next steps for common well-being measures that you're seeing. So maybe I'll just get out. Anyone from Fox Cities, Paula or Jason or Rayon, you have thoughts on that?
Well, I can go first, and the guys can maybe jump in. Well, I can speak from where our health system is taking this next. So we are asking the Cantrell ladder questions about where you stand today in your best possible life, and then asking where you think you're going to be in 5 years. We're asking that both individually and collectively, what their thoughts are, with respect to the community, to place. And then we are asking the questions also about on a scale of 1 to 5, how they think that they're doing their physical health, their mental health, their social health, financial health, and a sense of purpose in life. And then we also have some open-ended questions about what they would like to see, what they think are some of the things that sort of grease the skids, that really help improve the well-being in our community, and what are some of the barriers that we need to get over. So those are the questions in essence that we're asking in that survey in the Fox Cities. From a health system perspective, we are taking that beyond just the Fox Cities, which is basically, it's those 19 municipalities, but it covers about a 3-county region here. And because our health system serves 9 counties, we are actually in the process. We've attached to what Imagine Fox Cities is doing, and at the same time, just expanding the scope of the survey to be done across all 9 counties, which is urban and rural, and adds different sets of diversity, to the mix. And and we're really using that as the ultimate measure of how we know how our community is really doing over time. So we are, we're positioning this to be able to establish well-being across our region with United Way, with our community foundations, with all the nonprofits, with our chambers of commerce, so that we look to this measurement to be the North Star, not just for this Imagine Fox Cities work, but for this is really what it means, what we're striving for, across every business, every organization in our community, to tell how well we're doing. And because otherwise, when you're asked about how healthy is your community, or how well is your community doing, probably if your community's like ours, you tend to focus first on maybe some of those economic measures, how much production happens in the community, or from a health standpoint, you look at things like BMI scores, or maybe even county health rankings. but those aren't absolute, and county health rankings, you can do nothing and not change at all, but your score can go up or down depending upon what others around you are doing. And so this is, I think, is the truest sense of how well your community is doing. So we're looking to position this as the measurement that we look to over time to get a sense of how we're doing. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It's a hard question to answer.
Yeah.
I think you did a really good job.
Jason or Ryan, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just before I have to run, I have another meeting. So I apologize, but I wanted to wait around just to answer one or two questions. Paula did a phenomenal job answering that question, and I think a lot of times what we look at is what we're measuring, but we might have to get comfortable in order to get the authentic identities of who is telling us those stories. Because we will often measure, and our measurements might be blinded based on the makeup of your community. And we need to realize that our measurement practices probably can stay consistent, but what we need to look at is how are we discerning that data, how are we disaggregating that data to truly understanding who within our community need the most help if we're going to be focusing from a perspective of equity or targeted universalism. We can look, if we look at the Fox cities, if we weren't looking at it through the lens of targeted universalism and equity, the Fox cities look really good, right? It looks really good for rich white males. It doesn't look good for, you know, an African-American female living in poverty, or someone living with a disability, or someone you know, from the LGBTQ community. So we have to be targeted now with our approach of disaggregating data, so that we can definitely try to get an understanding of who is suffering, what are contributing towards that suffering, and where are these people located, in order to make sure that we create the spaces that all members of our community can show up and be authentic at all times.
Very well said. I see, Liz, you raised your hand. I wonder if you had a question or comment to add.
Yeah, I had a question. And it's about how we think about local and regional, and, you know, just listening to how you describe the area of all these efforts in the Fox cities. Because one of the things that I've learned, you know, over working in community for so many years, my definition of local might be really different than somebody else's definition of local. And so how you intersect and intertwine that local work with what you're trying to actually learn as a region, how do things like overlap and intersect with each other? You know, would just love to hear some of that.
Since nobody else is jumping, and I'll jump in. you know, and that's really that's really the challenge of all of this work, because local to me means the entire Fox cities, you know, but local to somebody who lives in Appleton versus Grand Chute versus Kimberly, you know, that it's a different deal. And I think one of the, you know, while I think if you ask people in each of those municipalities to describe local, they would say their own municipality. But one thing I think we were pretty successful with early on with this effort was we have the head of our community foundation here, which spans all of the Fox cities, so it's more of a regional entity. And we have a former COO from a major financial institution here who has long time family legacy in this community, well respected in the community, and a very progressive thinker. The two of them joined up to go municipality to municipality and talk one-on-one with each of those municipality leaders as we were even just thinking about this work. You know, so we we created the understanding early on about what this was about, to help ease any sense of, are we trying to annex anybody into the next municipality, or what is this, really all about? And multiple times throughout this process, we had those one-on-one, we sent those two people out, one-on-one with those municipality leaders to get buy-in to why this is really beneficial, and gave very specific examples. For example, one effort, we have a very new exhibition center here that just got started, and it is going to bring wealth to all of the municipalities around here. But it took a long time to get folks, it was a 20-year effort to make that happen. Whereas if folks had a common vision, it could have been done in 5, 6, or 7 years. And so these leaders were able to speak to very tangible examples of how, by having a common vision, that's co-created in our communities, how that could really move our entire region forward and benefit all.
Yeah. And so thanks for saying that, Paula, because that was, my thought process around it is, I don't know if we even think about it in the context of local or regional, based on how we're doing the work, because if we really do, the local needs of each municipality is what helped shape the overall vision of Imagine Fox Cities. So it worked its way up based on that targeted approach, where the voices of each of those municipalities were involved in the creation of the vision. The people of each of these municipalities were involved in creating this vision. So it was an idea that generated at the top, but the vision met in the middle. People worked its way up, and the leaders of Imagine Fox Cities basically adopted a shared vision from our community. So that vision speaks to someone who lives in Menasha, where I live, and it speaks to somebody that lives in Appleton, where Paula lived, and Jason and all of the municipalities, just based on how it was developed. Every single member of our region had the opportunity to put an ingredient in the pot. And once it came together, then they all understand that the outcome belonged to all of us. So, I think that's the critical piece of it, where no matter where we go within the Fox Cities, everyone understands this vision, understand the work that we're doing. And there is something that is connected to the growth and the progress for each member of these municipalities that function and as a part of the Fox Cities. And so that's where we sit right now. But I want to apologize, I have to run to another meeting, but thank you so much for giving us the space to share. And I'm available to engage with anyone in the future. Monty and Stacy can find me. But I appreciate these opportunities, and I appreciate learning from you as well.
Thank you so much.
And Rayon, I think you're echoing what I'm seeing in the chat box, which is a lot of expressions of gratitude as people begin to run to their next engagement. And I do want to honor folks' time, and just really wishing we had a little bit more time to hear from some of the participants in this group, and Colton and Rachel too. But I wonder if I just want to call back to something poignant that Rachel, you put in the chat, that said, we are getting really good at admiring gaps and problems. So all this work around measurement has got to be followed by meaningful change, and just appreciate you sharing that. And I'm going to just turn it back to Monty. If you can help us kind of wrap up, maybe, and I'll open that up to Liz too, kind of final thoughts, gratitude for hearing from you all and having so much participation. So Monty or Liz, anything you want to share or say before we wrap up today?
I'll just start and let Monty have the last word. But, just really gratitude for partners who've jumped on and continue to be a part of these conversations, because you are helping us shape, what comes next and what do we look like and how do we intersect with each other in coming years. So just really grateful for everyone finding time to be on the call. Thanks.
And I'll just, Liz, say, extending this idea that, Alicia, maybe it seems like there's some opportunities to really drill a little more deeply around some of this measurement engagement around well-being. And so, there's not enough time to do that now, but it seems like there's a real appetite for that. And again, just really appreciate both what leaders of Fox Cities and leaders here in North Sound are doing. I think both communities from our perspective are really on the frontier of what it looks like to advance equitable well-being and not do it in just abstract ways, but to really do that in meaningful ways. And so all the participants reminded us of what's really important. We need to measure what's important. We need to recognize that the systems were not designed for everybody to thrive. And it's within our reach to actually create systems where everybody is able to reach their full potential. And so applaud the efforts. I know that we're still all in early stages of the journey, and look forward to one of our next sessions together. Hope everybody has a great rest of the week.